You know how sometimes you hear about a food that seems to um, do more than just fill you up?
Yeah,
We're not talking about the usual suspects like protein or carbs today.
right.
We're taking a deep dive into something that often, flies under the radar but has some seriously interesting effects on your body. We're talking about resistant starch.
Exactly. Resistant starch. Think of it as like the rebel of the starch family.
A rebel? How so?
Well, unlike regular starches that your small intestine just breaks down pretty easily, resistant starch, it lives up to its name. It basically says, nope, not today, and travels all the way down intact to your colon.
Okay, so it makes it all the way to the colon. What's the big deal and once it gets there? Why does that matter?
That's where it gets really fascinating.
Mm.
Your colon is home to, well, trillions of bacteria, right?
Yeah.
Your gut microbiome.
Right.
And when resistant starch arrives, it's like their favorite meal shows up.
Okay.
And as they feast on it, they produce all these beneficial byproducts, most notably short-chain fatty acids.
Short chain fatty acids, yeah, we hear a lot about those being good news for our gut health.
Definitely.
And we're not just going off general knowledge today, are we? We've got some scientific heavy hitters in our source stack.
Absolutely. We're looking at two pretty compelling studies today. They used really cutting-edge techniques to get into the nitty-gritty of what happens when resistant starch interacts with our bodies.
Okay, tell me about them.
So one is from MBO back in 2017. It used what's called multiomics.
Multiomics.
Yeah, think of it like looking at the entire biological picture. You know, the genes, the proteins, the tiny molecules they produce, everything. They used it to see how high and low resistant starch diets affect people who already had reduced insulin sensitivity.
Okay, that sounds comprehensive. And the second one?
The second is more recent, Nature Metabolism from 2024. This one looks at whether boosting resistant starch intake can actually help with weight loss and improve metabolic health, specifically in people who are overweight or obese.
And it also looks at the gut microbes.
It does, yeah. Takes a close look at that bustling community of microbes in their guts, too.
Got it. So our mission for this deep dive is basically to unpack what these studies tell us about this, well, seemingly simple carbohydrate.
Exactly. How does resistant starch actually engage with our internal ecosystem, our microbiome? And what could that mean for things like um, how our bodies manage blood sugar or even our weight?
All right, let's jump into that first study then, the one from MBO. What did the researchers actually do? How is it set up?
Okay, so they designed what's called a crossover study.
Crossover.
Yeah, imagine you have two groups of people.
Yeah.
For the first part, Group A tries, say, the high-resistant starch diet, and Group B tries the low-resistant starch diet.
Okay.
Then, crucially, they have a break, a washout period to let their bodies kind of reset.
Right. Clears the slate.
Exactly. And then they switch. Group B tries the high RS diet, and Group A gets the low RS diet. It's a clever design because it helps researchers be more sure that any results they see are really down to the diet itself.
Makes sense. And the participants.
They all had reduced insulin sensitivity, which is an important detail. And throughout this whole process, the researchers collected fecal samples.
Okay, to see what was happening in the gut.
Precisely. They used those multi-omics techniques we mentioned,
Yeah.
a genetic census of the bacteria to see who's living there, the 16S RNA sequencing.
Mm-hmm.
Then an analysis of the proteins, the metaproteomics, to understand what the microbes are actually doing.
Right, their functions.
Yeah. And finally, a look at the metabolites, those tiny molecules they're churning out using metabolomics.
Okay, so they're getting a really, really in-depth look at the gut's activity. What were some of the key shifts they actually saw when people ate more resistant starch?
Well, one of the first big things they noticed was a change in the overall balance of the gut microbiome. Specifically, they saw an increase in the ratio of firmicutes to bacteroidetes.
Firmicutes and bacteroidetes.
Ah.
Those are like the two big dominant groups, the main families in your gut neighborhood, right?
That's a good way to put it, yeah. They're major
Yeah.
players.
So that ratio shifted. Did they see changes within those groups?
They did. Within that firmicutes family, they saw more of certain specific types of bacteria. Names like Faecalibacterium, Roseburia, and Ruminococcus popped up.
Ah, okay. I've definitely heard those names before. Aren't they often talked about as being like the good guys in the gut associated with a healthy gut?
They often are, yes. These bacteria are frequently linked to producing butyrate.
Butyrate, that short-chain fatty acid you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. It's a primary fuel source for the cells lining your colon, helps keep them healthy, and that can indirectly help improve how your body handles blood sugar.
And isn't it true that those same bacteria are sometimes lower in people with, say, type 2 diabetes?
That's often observed, yes.
Yeah.
They're frequently found in lower numbers in individuals with type 2 diabetes. So the key insight here is that resistant starch seems to be actively reconfiguring the gut microbiome. It's shifting it towards a profile that's more associated with better metabolic health, at least in this group.
Okay, that's really interesting. So the high-RS diet seems to be preferentially feeding these beneficial microbes. Now, what about the proteins, the metaproteomics part? What did that show?
Well, the protein analysis really backed up what they were seeing with the bacterial populations. It wasn't just that the bacteria were there, they were also seemingly more active in certain ways.
How so?
They found changes in the proteins related to how carbohydrates are metabolized and transported by the microbes. And specifically, they saw an increase in enzymes, the molecular machines doing the work involved in making butyrate.
Ah, so more butyrate-making machinery.
Exactly. Things like butyrate kinase and anoyl-CoA hydratase, these were more abundant when the participants were on the high-RS diet.
So it wasn't just that there were more of the bacteria that could make butyrate. It looks like they also had more of the actual tools to do it. That seems like a pretty clear signal.
It does, yeah.
Okay, what about the actual molecules being produced, the end products, the metabolites? What did the metabolomics tell them?
This is where the picture got even more complex and honestly quite intriguing. They found significant changes in the overall profile of metabolites, those tiny molecules in the gut after the high-RS diet compared to baseline.
Okay.
And what was really fascinating here is that they saw alterations in pathways related to lipid metabolism.
Lipid metabolism. Fats. In the gut. That feels unexpected from a carbohydrate source.
It really highlights just how interconnected everything is, doesn't it? The gut isn't just this isolated digestion tube. It's deeply involved in broader metabolic processes.
So what kind of lipid changes did they see?
Well, they found that several different types of fatty acids actually showed a positive correlation with both the high-RS and the low-RS diets, interestingly. But some specific fatty acids became less abundant with the high-RS diet, things like hexadecanoic acid, octadecadenoic acid, and octadecanoic acid.
So it's not just about boosting the good short-chain fatty acids like butyrate. Resistant starch seems to have this kind of knock-on effect, influencing other types of fats present in the gut environment, too.
Exactly. And there was another interesting little detail related to this.
Oh, yeah.
They looked at human proteins, too, not just microbial ones. And they found that human proteins involved in breaking down fats enzymes called lipases were relatively more abundant when people were on the high-RS diet.
Human lipases went up.
Yeah, while human alpha amylase, that's the main enzyme that breaks down starch in our small intestine, was negatively correlated. It was less abundant.
Okay, that part makes intuitive sense, right?
Hmm.
If the starch is resistant to digestion early on, our own starch-digesting enzymes wouldn't need to work as hard on it up there.
Precisely. It fits the picture.
So the big takeaway from this first MBio study seems to be that resistant starch isn't just passing through. It actively and pretty significantly reshapes the gut microbiome, who's there, what proteins they're making, what they're doing, and the resulting chemical environment, the metabolites.
Right.
And there are these really notable links to butyrate production, which we kind of expect, but also this emerging connection to fat metabolism, which is maybe more surprising.
Absolutely. You could kind of think of the MBio study as giving us the who and the what. Who are the microbes changing and what are they doing differently at a molecular level?
Okay, that paints a really detailed picture at the microbial level. So let's move on to the second study, the one from Nature Metabolism. How did their approach differ, and how did it build on this?
Right. So the first study gave us that deep dive into how resistant starch changes things inside the gut. The second study then takes it a step further to see what the sort of real-world health consequences of those changes might be.
Okay, looking at outcomes.
Exactly. This was a randomized, placebo-controlled crossover trial. Again, that strong crossover design. The participants were people classified as overweight or obese.
And what did they receive?
For 8 weeks, they either got a supplement of resistant starch or a placebo, which was just digestible cornstarch. Then, like the first study, a washout period, and then they switched.
And what were the researchers measuring?
They were looking at really tangible health outcomes. Changes in weight, body fat percentage, waist circumference. They also checked insulin sensitivity. And, like the first study, they analyzed the participants' gut microbiota this time using a technique called metagenomics, which gives an even broader view of the genetic potential. And they looked at metabolites, too.
Metagenomics, okay. And you mentioned something about mice.
Ah, yes. They did something else quite interesting. They took gut bacteria from some of the human participants, both from when they were on RS and when they were on the placebo, and transplanted into mice.
Fecal transplants into mice, that's a pretty direct way to test if the microbes themselves are causing the effects, isn't it?
It really is. It helps isolate the role of the microbiota.
So what were their big findings? What happened to the people taking the resistant starch?
Well, the headline finding was pretty significant. The resistant starch supplementation led to, on average, weight loss. About 2.8 kilograms, or roughly 6 pounds.
Wow, okay. That's noticeable.
Yeah. And they also saw reductions in fat mass and waist circumference. And importantly, they saw an improvement in how the participants' bodies responded to insulin, indicating better insulin sensitivity.
So real metabolic benefits along with the weight loss.
Exactly. The powerful takeaway here is that resistant starch isn't just, associated with these things. This study suggests it might be a direct driver of weight loss and improved metabolic health, potentially by remodeling your gut environment.
Okay, that's compelling. Did they see shifts in the gut microbiome that lined up with the first study, or were there different players involved?
They definitely saw changes in the gut microbiota, yes, with some specific nuances. They noted a particular increase in two types of bacteria, one called Bifidobacterium adolescentis and another Ruminococcus bromii.
Bifidobacterium adolescentis.
Yeah.
Okay. Any special significance there?
It seems so. The increase they saw in B. adolescentis was strongly linked, correlated with greater reductions in BMI and also visceral fat.
Visceral fat, that's the really unhealthy fat around the organs, right?
That's the one. And even more interesting, they found that participants who happened to have higher levels of B. adolescentis at the start of the study actually experienced a more significant decrease in their fat mass when they took the resistant starch.
Huh. It's like having that particular bug already there primes you for a better response. Almost like having a secret weapon in your gut.
It kind of looks that way, doesn't it? It
Yeah.
makes you wonder about, strategies to maybe encourage its growth beforehand.
Definitely. So B. adolescentis seems potentially key for this weight loss effect. What did they uncover about how? What were the mechanisms linking resistant starch, these microbes, and the health benefits?
This is where the mechanistic insights get really interesting. They found that the changes in the gut microbiota, driven by the resistant starch, led to shifts in the profile of bile acids in the body.
Bile acids, how do they fit in?
Well, they saw that levels of primary bile acids went down, while certain secondary bile acids like GCA and DCA, which they saw increase in the mice studies, went up.
And why does that matter?
It's significant because bile acids aren't just for digesting fats. They also act like signaling molecules, like messengers, that can influence metabolism, how your body manages energy, inflammation, and fats. So shifts here can have broad effects.
Okay, interesting connection. In those mice transplants you mentioned, what did those experiments show?
Right. The mice that got the gut bacteria from people who had been taking resistant starch showed some pretty remarkable changes compared to mice getting bacteria from the placebo phase.
Such as?
They had less inflammation. The researchers think this was because the gut barrier, the lining of the gut, was healthier, more restored. They saw lower levels of pro-inflammatory signals.
Less leaky gut, maybe.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
And something else really striking. The gut bacteria from the resistant starch group seemed to reduce how much fat the mice absorbed from their food.
Reduce fat absorption? How?
They found increased activity of a specific gene, ANGPTL4, in the lower part of the small intestine, the ileum. This led to reduced activity of the enzymes that digest fat, and consequently the mice excreted more fat in their feces.
Wow. So resistant starch feeds certain bacteria, changes bile acids, reduces inflammation, and reduces fat absorption. That's quite a chain of events.
It's a really fascinating proposed mechanism, yes.
And what about that link they found specifically with B. adolescentis in the humans? Did they follow up on that?
They did. They actually gave male mice B. adolescensis on its own as a supplement. And they found that just giving them this one bacterium protected them from gaining weight on a high-fat diet. It also changed their bile acid and short-chain fatty acid profiles.
So that really strengthens the case for B. adolescentis being a crucial player?
It certainly points strongly in that direction, yeah. So you could think of this nature metabolism study as telling us the so what? What are the actual benefits for you, the person eating the resistant starch?
Right. So the second study really takes the findings of the first, those detailed microbial shifts, and shows they're not just, interesting biological changes happening in a petri dish or, I guess, in the gut. They're connected to real, measurable health improvements in people, like weight loss and better insulin sensitivity. And it starts to map out how that might be happening through these effects on bile acids, inflammation, fat absorption.
With B adolescent as looking like a really important mediator, at least in this context.
Okay, so if we try and connect these two studies, pull it all together, what's the bigger picture here?
Well, I think the most obvious thing is the consistency across both studies, right? They both clearly show that resistant starch has a significant measurable impact on the gut microbiome. That seems undeniable.
It's not just inert fiber passing through, it's actively engaging with this complex ecosystem.
Precisely. And you see how the studies complement each other. The first one, MBO, gives us that incredibly detailed molecular snapshot, the specific bacteria changing, the proteins, the metabolites.
The who and the what.
Right. And then the second study, Nature Metabolism, demonstrates the tangible health benefits in humans' weight loss, improved insulin sensitivity, and links those benefits back to the microbial shifts, starting to unravel the why and how.
And we're seeing some overlap maybe in the types of bacteria that seem important, like ruminococcus showing up in both contexts, perhaps, and the broader firmicutes group.
Yes, and it really highlights the potential role of specific bacteria. You know, the Faecalibacterium, Roseburia, ruminococcus we saw emphasized in the first study, and then particularly this B. adolescentis taking center stage in the second study for weight management.
And both studies, in different ways, touch on this really interesting link between resistant starch, the gut microbiome, and how our bodies handle fats.
Absolutely. Whether it's the altered fatty acid profiles in the gut environment seen in the first study, or the more direct effects on bile acids and reduced fat absorption suggested by the second, it's clearly an area that's generating a lot of interest.
Yeah, it feels like an emerging theme.
It does. Now, of course, we should always remember these are just two studies.
Right, the caveats.
Yeah, and they have limitations, like any research, sample sizes, the specific groups of people involve people with reduced insulin sensitivity in one, overweight obese in the other. We definitely need more research to confirm these findings in, broader populations in different contexts.
Standard scientific process. But the underlying message, it seems pretty clear, doesn't it? Your gut microbiota appears absolutely essential. They're the key players, the intermediaries in how resistant starch delivers these potential benefits.
That seems to be the critical insight, yes. Feed your gut bugs right with things like resistant starch, and they can, in turn, produce compounds and send signals that really impact your overall well-being and metabolism. Resistant starch is definitely more than just fiber.
It's an active modulator of our internal world.
Well put.
Okay, so to try and wrap this up and bring it all together for everyone listening, resistant starch isn't just something that, passes through your system undigested.
Right.
It acts as a specific fuel source for beneficial bacteria deep in your gut. Feeding them leads to significant changes, shifts in the bacterial community, their activity, the chemicals they produce. And these changes seem linked to improvements in our metabolism, like potentially better blood sugar control, improved insulin sensitivity, and maybe even, as the second study strongly suggests, supporting weight management.
And this, I think, leads to a really practical, maybe thought-provoking question for you listening. Could consciously, strategically incorporating more resistant starch into your daily diet be a feasible way to nudge your own gut microbiome towards a healthier state?
Yeah, and potentially support your weight and metabolic health goals in the process.
That's definitely something to consider.
It really makes you think differently about common foods, doesn't it? Things like cooked and cooled potatoes or rice, green bananas, oats, legumes.
Yeah, those are classic sources.
And how things like cooking methods might actually change the amount of resistant starch. Cooling pasta or potatoes after cooking, for instance. It's definitely something worth looking into further for practical tips.
Absolutely. We'd encourage you to explore this topic more if it interests you, and of course, always best to consult with healthcare professionals like a doctor or registered dietitian for personalized dietary advice.
Good point.
But the science of the gut microbiome is just moving so incredibly fast. It's genuinely exciting to see how these dietary components, things we might not have paid much attention to before, can have such potentially profound effects on our health.
It really is a fascinating frontier. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us into the world of resistant starch and the gut microbiome.
My pleasure.
Until next time, keep exploring the fascinating world within you.